Afternoon, everybody. I thought the weather is going to come in the way, but good numbers. So welcome to this first seminar in Northwest series on mathematical biology and data science. And today it's my pleasure to welcome Maricio Álvarez. Maricio is a senior lecturer in machine learning in computer science in Manchester. And he has academic positions in Pereira, in Colombia. I tried to find in Colombia and also in Sheffield.
Yeah.
So Mauricio is working on machine learning methodologies and also the applications in biology and healthcare, I think. And on the methodology side, he is interested in multi-output Gaussian processes and physics-inspired probabilistic modeling. And Mauricio has been organizing this GP summer school for many years, I think 2016 or 17 onwards. And also he co-organized LS summer school last year in Manchester on machine learning for healthcare and biology. Today his talk is going to be quite ML focused, and he's going to discuss latent force models and how they can bridge the gap between data-driven methods and also more mechanistic modeling approaches. I'm hoping there'll be some biological applications will be there too.
I hope so.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. So this idea of the latent force model is actually quite old. It was part of my PhD back maybe more than 10 years ago. So I did a lot of sort of engineering with these models after I finished my PhD, but then when I returned to the UK, I started to look at these models again and doing some sort of extensions. And I hope that I can talk about more about those extensions that are actually quite recent. So oops. Working? No, it's not working. Okay. Right. So so there are these two ways of modeling. So you could say there are two camps of modeling. So hardcore data-driven people refer to this way of doing things as black box modeling. And the sort of the paradigmatic approach there is to have these gigantic, huge neural networks, and you have enough compute and enough data to train those neural networks and find the right over-parameterization, if you will, for those models. Then on the other side, you have this way of sort of approaching modeling, which is more sort of white box modeling, where you typically uncover this physics of what's going on in the phenomenon. But obviously doing this is very hard when you have a complex system. And then there is a lot of things happening in between. People trying to do this gray box modeling in engineering, where we try to bridge the gap between these two worlds. So I'm going to show one way of doing it in probabilistic modeling using Gaussian processes in particular. So we like this way of doing things because this extrapolates transfers, whereas this is not really necessarily so. So you have, once you have a problem then, and you have a new problem, then usually you will need to train your model again. So this model is quite good for interpolation, but this kind of modeling can do both very well, interpolation and extrapolation. Problem here is that you don't know all the specification of the system, and that's why it's difficult to just stick with this way of doing modeling. So we have potentially, you have heard a lot about sort of the intersection of machine learning and physics. So there is sort of this workshop that has been organized on Eurips, where it's machine learning for the physical sciences. And one way of doing this is you have the physics here, and then you have the psychic, which is your machine learning that helps you solve your physics problem. That's not what we're going to do here. What we're going to do here is more this flavor. So you have your machine learning model, yeah, and then you have your physics that empowers the machine learning model to do better. So we're going to do physics inspired or physics constrained machine learning. Okay? And we're going to do it in a very specific flavor. So my machine learning model is going to be a GP, a Gaussian process. And then I'm going to use all these different ways to impose some constraints on the way that the GP works. Okay. And that's what we call latent force models. So basically, we put in this information from the ODEs or PDEs into the GP. Okay. And I'm gonna do that in the context of Bayesian modeling. So, do you know what is this? Yeah, Bayes theorem. Okay. Right. So we start with some prior assumptions, and then we combine that with this term called the likelihood function. And then if we can normalize and we can do things or approximate this, then we compute the posterior distribution. So in my case, the prior function is going to be this, prior distribution is going to be this Gaussian process. A Gaussian process is basically the probability, so it's a stochastic process that acts as a probability distribution over functions. So here you see some samples of that distribution. They are quite smooth. Each of those lines is one sample of those. And then one nice thing we get with these being probabilistic models is that you get the uncertainty over those functions, which here is like a gray box, sorry, gray background as you see there. So now, once we have some data, for example, we have two data points here, x1, and then some function evaluated in xi. We don't know what that function is, x2 and some other function, and the function evaluated in x2. We combine these and then we compute this thing called the posterior distribution. So this is the posterior distribution. Now I have updated the knowledge that I have about my function because I have observed these two data points. And now I get what I consider to be a mean function, right? And then the uncertainty has also changed. The uncertainty now is 0 in the points where I have data. And then sort of expands as I go a little farther away from the data. And then the dashed lines that you see here are samples from this new Gaussian process that has been conditioned to these data points. So I'm going to do everything on the context of this Bayesian model, right? So this is a simple example with an ODE, a second order differential equation. So this is a second order differential equation. It's sort of representing a mass spring damper system. You have your mass constant. You have your damper constant and you have your spring constant here. And then when we have a data problem, there are a lot of things here that could be uncertain. Maybe there are a lot of things that we don't know here, okay? So there might be a problem for which you have data and you have some idea that the data comes from this differential equation, but you don't know the parameters anymore. So you don't know what is M, you don't know what is C, you don't know what is B. The data might come FT, so FT could be, you could have some points for F, but then maybe you don't have enough points. So you have a lot of uncertainty about F, potentially. Or you could also have uncertainty on UT, so you don't know what is the input to that system. So essentially, you could do that, all of those things with this framework that we have here. But the thing I'm going to focus on, the approach I'm going to focus on is assuming that I will have some data for F, and then I'm going to put a Gaussian process prior on this U2, or sorry, UT. So this UT is going to be something like this here, okay? And then because I'm doing basically a linear operation over a Gaussian process, as we're going to see over and over during the talk, I can also compute the particular characteristics of this GPFT. It's going to be a GP because it's a linear operation of a GP, right? And then as a byproduct of all this, I can have an objective function that I can use not only to feed hyperparameters for you, but also I can use that to find point estimates for these parameters MC and B if I'm interested in that. Okay. By the way, you have questions, please interrupt. So this is the second order system, and then there's the spring map, damper mass, and then I'm acting as a force here. So the force is a Gaussian process, and then I'm measuring something here. So if I have observations for the input, so for the force and for the output, then there are some nice things that I can illustrate here in terms of the physics. So you see that things that happen at some time point in terms of the force appear a little bit later in terms of the output. So there are things that the physics is describing, because I'm using the physics here, then I can see that things like inertia and things like, for example, with a second order system like a resonance, those are behaviors that I can actually incorporate into the model. That would so easy to model with say GPs that don't take into account this system. So maybe you like this example better. I'm not an expert on Drosophila, by the way. Just try to seduce you a little bit with this example, hopefully. So I work on this a lot, and hopefully Minjin is gonna start working on that at some point as well. So there is this gap gene network in the Drosophila that is responsible for segmented body pattern. So this is the fruit fly. And then some genes in the network, which are called maternal genes, determine the polarity of the embryo along its anterior posterior axis. So basically, these plots look like this here. So the anterior posterior axis could be something like a line here. Yeah. And then the maternal genes interact with these other genes called the trunk gap genes, and that network of interactions establish this pattern of segmentation into Drosophila. So when you look at this data set, this is kind of the data set that you get. So you have the expression for some of them. This specific one for the trunk gap genes, which are called hunchback, Ruppel, giant, and nips. So the image here is a very specific one. It corresponds to a gene expression for this hunchback is the blue stripes, the nips is the green stripes, and the skip genes is the red stripes. So these organisms have been studied very well in terms of the physics, but usually it's a nonlinear model that is used to describe the gene expression. Something that we did in the past is just to linearize that differential equation. I use something very simple like this, which is the diffusion PDE equation. And then, so in this here, we have first derivative with time, then the second derivative with the space. But in this case, it's just one line because it's just this axis I was mentioning before. And then you have your, in this case, the mRNA is going to be your input, and then the output is going to be your protein product. And again, you could either start assuming that you know the diffusion rate constant, and that you know the decay constant, or those are things that you potentially can estimate from your data. So we do the same thing, as I was explained before. I'm not interested necessarily in putting the Gaussian process on the F. I put it first on U, and then I work out what is the Gaussian processes for F. So this is a data set that we have. The difficulty with this is that usually you don't have a lot of data for U, or maybe you don't even have data for U. You have some data for it. And then you want to sort of a posteriori see what is the uncertainty for U, given that you have some data for F, and you have this model for F between F and U, basically. So in this collaboration that we have with Nicola Duran, I was a postdoc working at some point with Magnus. We have this data set where we have this mRNA expression. So we have data for these 3 genes, and we also have the data for the gap proteins. So we just wanted to look how good this diffusion equation was for modeling this type of data. So what we did was to put the GP over the mRNA and then compute the GP, what would be the GP for F, and then condition on some data of F, then predict what would be the predictions for U. And then because we have the data for U, not always can do that. But here we have the data for U. We can compute. We can assess how was the prediction for U. And then we could also have put the GP on F, and then work out what was the GP for U. That was the other thing that we did. We can also do the maths because again it's a linear operation, so we can do the same. And then only use data for U instead of using data for F. That's another thing that you could do. Or you could do both. So you could have the data for U and the data for F, and try to see how good the model predicts in other parts of the space where you don't have data. So one interesting thing here is the boundary conditions and the initial conditions. Usually people don't pay too much attention to those things, but in this framework, they are kind of sort of straightforward to include in the sense that the method that you use is similar to the method to compute the GP. So this is a very, very long table, but I just want to highlight this part here. So this is this column here is where we put the GP on the mRNA, and this column here is where we put the GP on the protein. So this one is the one I've been promising for a while now. And then we only use training data from the F, right? And then predict, find the U, and then compare the predictions of the U against the data that we have for the mRNA. And these are some results that we get from this. And then we can do predictions also for the rest of the data that we don't use in F, and these are some results that we get. So we can go through this data, but I think I was just trying with this just to give you a flavor of the things that we can do. So I'm not gonna talk about the data anymore. Okay. Right. Any question?
We're quite a free slide actually. What about those some data were both characters with some and not? So what's the mean?
What do you mean, second?
Some of them was highlighted, like 90.5 plus minus 2.0. And what some are not.
Oh, the performance
Yeah.
is a little bit better here than here.
No, I'm talking about what's it called? Both characters. Control plus B. Why do you control plus B some of this?
Oh, this one.
Yeah.
Oh, that's the standard deviation in there.
No, I'll talk to you afterwards.
Okay. Right. So now that I gave you a little flavor of how this method works, I'm gonna go into the details of the method. Okay. I'm very looking forward to get to this section. So Gaussian process basics. Who has heard about Gaussian processes before? All of you. Okay. So this is gonna be quick. Okay, let's move on. So what is a Gaussian process? So this is the textbook of a Gaussian process, textbook definition of a Gaussian process, stochastic process, with the property that you define a finite number of random variables and you take them from the process, then they follow a multivariate Gaussian distribution. So to define the GP, you need two functions, the mean function and the kernel function. And basically these are templates to build finite multivariate distributions for vectors. Yeah. So this one allows you to build covariance matrices and this one mean vectors. And as I mentioned before, one of the common uses is as prior of a functions in Bayesian modeling. So again, here we have our prior, and then once you observe some data points, then we sort of reduce the uncertainty in some parts of the space. Condition to that, then we have a new Gaussian process with a modified mean function and a modified covariance function. So the work on latent force models is very related to Gaussian processes for multiple outputs. So I didn't talk about, so the way that I introduced latent force model was just in the context of one output. So you were just modeling one position in the spring mass damper system or one of the genes in the gap gene network. But actually what we do generally is to use multiple outputs. And then, so work on multiple outputs is really old. People have been studying these models in geostatistics for a long time, where they call them co-creaking. So the problem that we have is that, well, this is what we usually do with a GP. So you have this data set, you have some data points, and then you work very hard to uncover what is the good covariance function for that data. And then you use that to build your kernel matrices or your covariance matrices. And that's what you use actually when you're doing predictions. But in a lot of problems, what we do have is actually multiple outputs. And then the question there is, how do I exploit this correlation in a good way? I mean, how do I use that correlation to increase the performance of my model? So the easiest thing to do is just to assume that they are independent, and because they are Gaussians, the correlation is zero, so they are Gaussians that are also independent. But what we actually want to do is to be able to exploit these cross covariances. So we want to have a clever way to build those covariances. And one way to do it is through this framework, which is called the process convolution. And basically, latent force models are going to be an example of that. Okay. How do we build these joint covariances? So I start with this generic model. So we have this SU index D is running over the number of outputs. So in general, we have capital D of those. So you can imagine having capital D of these dynamical systems with constant coefficients. And then you have a set of common latent processes UQ that are sort of being the input to that those differential equations. And then it turns out that these differential operators will have a corresponding Green's function. I can compute the corresponding Green's function if I solve this equation here. In a way that then the output D can be written as the sum that you see here where this FDQ is gonna be this convolution operation between this Green's function and this latent process UQ. So now if you say that this latent process is a Gaussian process with a particular covariance, because this is a linear operator acting over the GP, then the FDQs are also gonna be Gaussian processes. So there is a lot of maths here, but I'm just gonna give you just the overview of the GP, of the sort of the latent force model, right? So if we assume that those latent functions are independent, we have capital Q of those, and each of them follows this template. So it's gonna be a GP with mean zero and covariance of kernel function KQ. Then you can work out the maths and you can see that it's gonna be the form of the covariance between an output D and an output D prime is gonna have this expression here. Yeah, so you're gonna have the sum over Q. Remember, capital Q is the number of latent functions that you have that are independent. And then you're gonna have this double integral here, because you're gonna have to integrate over over tau and tau prime, which are the arguments for the kernel function. And this kernel function is the kernel function of this latent GPU. So you basically need to solve this double integration here. And that's sort of, from the point of view of latent force model, is the more technical step that you need to do, right? Any question? Right, so what is this Green's function? So remember, this Green's function is associated with the differential operator. Yeah. So for example, if the differential operator or the differential equation is just the first order, then typically this is just the decaying exponential. If the differential equation is the second order, that's going to be a decaying exponential times the sign, and so on and so forth. The complexity grows as you increase the order of the ODE. Right. So let's go back to the second order ODE, and now we only have we not only have one system, we have capital D system. So we can assume we have capital D outputs, and this is the differential equation for all those outputs D equals 1 to capital D. But all of them are being driven by the same set of linear combinations of Gaussian processes. Right, and then what I want to do then is, because I know the Green's function associated to these operators, I want to compute, if I know the covariance functions for U, I know the Green's functions for this differential equation, I can now have an expression for the covariance function of the F of the Fs, or the cross covariance function between FD and FD prime, right? So this is what FD will look like. I already shown you this before, but more generic. Now I'm showing you the same expression, but with a particular Green's function, and this Green function corresponds. So this Green's function is just a specific Green's function for the second order ODE. Second ODE. Yeah. And then, so there are some terms here. So we have the mass, for example, appearing here of the system D or output D. We have this guy here, which is a frequency, and then which is defined in this way. And then depending on the covariance that we assume for UQ, when we can solve this in analytical form. Okay, so well, this is what's, again, so like a pictorial representation of what's happening. I'm having the weighted sum of linear functions UQ. I use these coefficients, by the way, I haven't mentioned it, but these coefficients sort of represent what is the sort of, we call them sensitivities, and it's sort of like what is the strength which that force is acting with respect to that particular output T, right? And then for each output, I will have a system like this one, right? So as I said before, nice thing about this is that you can incorporate physics already into your model. So you can include behaviors like inertia, resonance. We refer back then to these models as latent force models, but not all of them are necessarily a force. I guess like we started thinking about the second order differential equation, which is very sort of related to a mechanical system, and then that's why we use this force model. Maybe this was not a very good name at the time. It's sort of a physics constrained ML, they call it these days. So one way of thinking of our model is to consider it as puppetry. Yeah. So you have a puppet moving these forces here, yeah, and making some sort of movement for the puppet. And this is what you observe. So by observing this, what you want to do is to uncover what are the forces generating a particular movement. Right, so this is an example with 3 outputs and 1 latent force. So we have 3 systems that are characterized by this big mechanical behavior. Underdamped system is basically a system that once receives some sort of input, then sort of starts oscillating until eventually it reaches a steady state. An overdamped system is one when it gets this input, then very quickly it reaches the steady state, and the critically damped system is one sort of in between. And then we can sample from this large Gaussian process and observe all these nice behaviors. So the cyan here is the latent process, UT, and then you see like the different behaviors happening. So the underdamped system acting a little bit like sort of more following the input. And then the green, the overdamped, actually not moving a lot. It struggles to move with the input. And the blue one is the critically damped. It moves a little bit more than the green one, but not as fast. Right. So this is the maths that you need to solve. So I showed you before that we have to solve that double integral. So this is the solution to the double integral. It's pretty upsetting. So you have all these terms here, and then this H term has this here, right? So this is the exponential of minus gamma d, and then this guy here is this, right? So these are exponentials, and this is called the complex error function. So the argument is going to be a complex quantity, right? And typically, you need numerical methods to solve that. And so I remember back then coding this in Fortran, and using MATLAB to code the Fortran code because it was easier. But then my master students later on did everything in C++. Right. So that's a Latent Force model. So if you then want to estimate hyperparameters, you can do the same things that we do with just a single output GPs. We can use the marginal likelihood. In this case, our covariance matrix is going to be larger than the single output case, because you need to account for the number of outputs. But in principle, you can do this depending on the size of the number of outputs and the number of data observations that you have. Now, by the way, you don't need to have the same number of observations per output. Each output could have a different number of outputs. And then the way that you compute the elements in this kernel matrix is by using that horrible expression that I showed you before, right? Okay, yeah, and then we published this paper in 2009 in AI Stats. That was a conference paper, and then we extended that in this FAMI paper, this journal in 2013. And that's where we included a bit of the Drosophila example. Right, so that's the basic latent force model. So the takeaway message is, oh, it's a fancy GP. Basically, it's a GP with a very nice and sophisticated covariance function that has been somehow derived from these differential equations, Green's functions, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Now, I'm going to talk about more recent work, which sort of extends this to nonlinear cases. And there are two ways of including the nonlinearity. So one way is through what we call, what are known in engineering as the Volterra series, which are ways in dynamical systems to include soft nonlinearity. So it can't really account for all types of nonlinearity, but it accounts for a good range. And then I'm going to talk about compositions of these models more in the sort of way that we would do like neural networks. Okay. So let's see if I have time to talk about that. So these are nonlinear process convolutions. So in the convolution that we had before, we didn't have this many integrations here. We only have GD t minus tau 1 times the u, tau 1 in that case. But we can actually do something called a Volterra series. So Volterra series is textbook in dynamical systems. They teach you how to do nonlinear systems in a particular way. And this is the way that we do it. Basically, what we're doing is that we have a product of these underlying inputs, and then we have a sum of these integrations here. So the smoothing kernel, the dimensionality starts growing with the dimension or with the number of terms that you want to include in the series. And then the C, capital C, gives you sort of the degree of the Volterra series. So if you want to do the same that we were doing before as a way to just check how general is this model in terms of expressing those nonlinearities, then we're sort of in a bit of a problem, because now if I want to say this is a GP, then it turns out that this is not a GP anymore. So the nice thing that I had before breaks, because this is not linear anymore, right? So what do we do there? So the first approach that we took was to say, well, you know what? If I have a system and the input to the system is like a normal distribution of a Gaussian process, I know because the system is linear, then the output is also going to be a Gaussian process. Now, when the system is non-linear, then I'm going to get another stochastic process, and I'm not really sure what that stochastic process looks like, because it could have a lot of different sort of moments. But the first thing that we said in this first work was to say, okay, let's just assume that the output of that system, whatever output it is, I'm only just going to care about the mean and the covariance of that process, right? And then I'm just going to approximate that output process as a Gaussian process. So what I need to compute now is the mean and the covariance for that function. So basically what I need to do is to compute the mean for this expression and the, well, for FD, and then the covariance between FD C and FD prime C. That's what I have to do. So these two guys here. So this is some of the highlights. So this is just a simulated example where we had this latent process UT. So it was basically a sine function. So you see the sine function as a dashed line, right? And then you have two outputs. So the way that we created the data for the output, so with these red dots here is the data. So this is the linear case, C is equal to 1. So that's the convolution that I had in the first place at the beginning. And then for output 1, the way that we create this data, say, well, for the positive cycle of the sine, this is going to be a constant value plus some noise. And for the negative cycle, it's going to be the negative value plus some noise. Now for output 2, the nonlinearity is going to be it's just basically a constant times the value of the sine in the positive cycle, and then just going to be 0 for the negative cycle. So we apply this model with different values of C and try to do predictions and see how to do, how well we can do. So things that we can notice immediately. So when we have the C equals 1, because this is basically a GP, just with a different covariance, a slightly different covariance function, then GPs can't really do this kind of thing, yeah? So they struggle to get this kind of behavior where they need to suddenly change the way they behave, whereas this model actually can do that, yeah? So they're able to sort of get those sort of nonlinear behaviors. I'm not very happy with this. But then this odds try to, I mean, this is a very difficult problem, yeah, because you want to, well, the idea will be that you want to recover this dashed black line with the data you have. Well, you kind of do, but you don't have data for you, so it's a difficult problem, yeah. But this nonlinearity here was quite interesting together with this model. So that's what you can do with this. Now, how you do it, right? So we need to do quite a few assumptions in this. So in this first work, we did quite a few assumptions. We later relaxed them in a paper after that. But then we had to say that Volterra kernel of order C, we're just gonna assume that it's just a product of simple kernels acting over each of the input dimensions. So we call those separable kernels. And then in that case, then the output could be expressed like this, right? So you have a product of convolutions over each of the input dimensions, basically, right? But still is a nonlinear system, okay? Because you still have the product of these GPs. So this is not a GPN, right? So you need to compute this expected value, right? So you need to apply this expected value over this sum times this product. And then you need to compute the covariance. So you will need to compute this other expected value over this. So you need to compute the expected value basically of a product of variables, which are Gaussian right? Because it's this basically is this here, yeah? So it's a product of Gaussian variables, and then you have a product Gaussian variables. So it's a slightly larger product, but it's still a larger, it's a product Gaussian variables. And then we found this very nice letter in statistics and probability. So this is a paper that's an explicit formula for product moments of multivariate Gaussian random variables, right? And it turns out that it has, somebody had already worked out all the products, all the equations for the products that you need. So basically what we did was to use those results in the case of the Gaussian process, and then you get this very nice software where when you say what is the order of C, when you say, well, I want a Volterra kernel order 5, it will automatically give you the expression for your new covariance function, your kernel, or the expression for your mean function. Right. Okay, I'm gonna skip this. And later, what Magnus did, my PhD student, was to say, well, in all these, we have assumed, if we go back to the latent force model where we knew this Green's function, so we knew the shape of the Green's function. Here we have to assume that we know the form of G. So somehow we need to know what's the parametric form of the form for G. You need to specify the function. So what he did was to actually complicate this model a little bit more and say, well, what happens if I put priors, GP priors, not only on the latent function, but also on the kernel, right? So this is what Magnus did. So we call these non-parametric Volterra kernels. So it turns out that people have already done this kind of thing. They have tried, Richard Turner's group a few years back, they tried to do this one, not the nonlinear one, but then they assumed that the latent process was also always gonna be a white noise process. And the scheme that they used for inference was really awful. It was a combination of Monte Carlo with variational inference. It was really, really awful. So what Magnus did actually was to use pathwise conditioning, which is actually a very recent, was actually not very recent, but it was proposed many years ago by Gaines in machine learning that rediscovered everything as new. And then they rediscovered it. And then now you can apply that way of sampling, functional sampling, very nicely to this type of models. So a nice thing, for example, is this control problem, where, so basically this is the two-tank problem. I don't know whether you have heard about it, but then essentially it is like they're injecting water to the top of the tank. There are two tanks, so they're injecting water at the top of the tank, say on the top, and then it starts filling, but then the water of the tank goes to the tank below, and then that one starts filling out. So what you want to know is what level of water you need to inject on the top tank, such that you get both tanks filled at a certain level. Because you're sinking water on the tank below, then obviously you need a control signal to do that. And the benchmark that they give you is that they give you the signal of the output, right? And then you need to, they give you one signal of the output, one signal of the input, that's your training data. And then your test data is that they give you just the signal of the output. And what you want to do is to infer what was the input. So what was the control signal that was used? And this was the control signal in the test data. And this is the green one is the one that we get with a third order Volterra model, which is it's not very good in terms of the MSE, but it's better than many other models in terms of the uncertainty quantification, because a lot of models are really overconfident over the prediction. Right, I don't have time to talk about this. I'm just going to mention this to finish. I have 5 minutes. Composition of latent force models. Previously, I showed you this double integral that was really upsetting and led to this very complex kernel function. So we're looking at this work in machine learning that is very well cited, which is called random Fourier features for kernel methods. I won the test of time award and Reeves in 2017 by Rahimi and Brech. And basically what they did is say, well, back then kernel machines were more popular than today. So Like you have a stationary kernel, you can use Faulkner theorem to express it this way. Yeah, so this is the integration, this is a probability measure, and this is the complex exponential of the two arguments of the kernel. And depending on the form of this probability distribution, then you will have different types of kernels here. Like, for example, in the case of this exponentiated quadratic kernel, which is the one that we use a lot in our latent force model, then this distribution is a Gaussian distribution, right? And then instead of working with the kernel, what you do is that you work with this side of things. So what you do is that you sample from this Gaussian, and then it's just a sum, right? And this is the way that you approximate a kernel. So they call this the inverse kernel trick, right? So the kernel trick was going from basis functions to kernels. Now you go from kernels to basis functions. So you can see where I'm going with this. So instead of using this kernel for the latent force model, I'm going to use this form of the kernel for the latent force model and break the kernel so that I can express it as basis functions as well. And this is what we did, or Christian did. So instead of having this double integral, I put here the Faulkner theorem and I interchange the order of the integration. And then basically I get this type of solution here that I can then sample to get a basis sort of representation, basis function representation for my kernel. So, but now those basis functions are actually a bit more involved because they would involve this complex exponential transform by this Green's function. I know what that appeared. Maybe there is a question or something.
Yeah, it's fine. I'd send a message.
Right. So that's what we do. And then to do this, because now it doesn't, I mean, this is very easy to do. I mean, this is just a complex exponential times a Green's function, well, which is a function of one argument, it's a real function. This is a complex. You can use Laplace transforms for this. So you can do Laplace transform, solving the Laplace domain, and then transform back to obtain the time expression, or the expression in the time domain. And then you can automate that symbolically. So I have an undergrad student doing that very nicely, and he did it for equations until order 5 or 6. So you get this equation, and then it gives you basically the kernel, because now the kernel is built this way, and then you just need to sample to get the approximation of the kernel. I'm gonna jump these. So this is a nice visualization of what happens. So this is the ODE with that expression that I showed you before. That was the exact expression, and you have two outputs, F1 and F2. And then this is an approximation when I just use 100 samples from that Monte Carlo approach. And then the approximation is really good. I mean, you can run this really fast. And because it's basis functions, basis vectors, basically you can use all the tricks that we know from linear algebra to efficiently invert those kind of matrices. So you can reduce computational complexity in the same way. I think I'm going to stop there because we have run out of the time, I think. Right. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Tom's work. So he graduated, well, actually had his bye-bye, I think 2 months ago. So there's this thing called deep Gaussian process, which is basically a composition of Gaussian processes. But there was this nice paper by Kutahar and authors, 2017, ICML, where basically they say, well, rather than working with the covariance function version for the GP, we're going to work with the basis function representation for the GP. And because you're now in the world of the basis function representation, basically that's a Bayesian neural network. And then you can just use those basis functions, linearly transform them, and so on, and do all this, or what we do in neural networks. So what we did was, okay, that looks cool. What if we put some physics in those basis functions? Yeah, so the basis functions that we had before were just random Fourier features. Now we're going to put these more sophisticated basis functions. So this is what Tom did. So here is like the schema for that first approach. And then now we include these operators acting on these basis functions. And then we tested this for extrapolation. So this is a data set. It's called the Charis data set in Physionet. So you have these 3 time series data. And what we wanted to do was, let's train this model, this multi-output model, deep latent force model, and deep Gaussian processes with data from 0 to 0.7. And then after 0.7, we just let it run and see what happens, right? And then we did that with the deep Gaussian process in this column, and then with deep latent force model, where all those models were using just one latent force. And then what you can see here is that deep latent force model captures better this kind of behavior here. So this oscillatory behavior. The DGP is very vanilla here, so it doesn't really follow very well the output. So here is a sort of a zoom in of that behavior. So the deep latent force model and the deep Gaussian process. Right. This is a more recent work that my other student is doing, where he is sort of improving on the type of random Fourier features that you can use using this new thing called random reproducible Hilbert space Fourier features. I don't have time to go through this, so I think I'm just gonna finish here. So I just finished with a vision for this. So I started talking about these two camps of modeling. But there are a lot of things happening in between, right? So you have causal models, and then question is, where are these causal models sitting? Are they closer to the physics-based modeling? Are they closest to statistical-based modeling? So to what extent they are close? So there is this whole spectrum of modeling that perhaps we can attempt to, to have, as alternatives. So our causal models here. And then what I think is that we should describe this spectrum with a latent space, and then have some sort of fine tuning of these latent variables that tell us where we should sit in this spectrum. Right. So to summarize, latent force models incorporate dynamical systems and PDEs in a kernel function. I show you an example of how to do nonlinear models with Volterra series. We can also learn non-parametric versions of those. And then a very nice thing with these random Fourier features, you can speed up the computation of the latent force models. I think that's it. Thank you.